Hey, you. Thanks for joining me. So, I wanted to talk today about how our brains can be so different, how we can experience the world and process things so differently. And we don't often talk about these things, but I think it's so fascinating and I definitely think it's worth talking about. Part of this video is inspired by me realizing that I don't visualize things in my head and other people do. For some people, that is totally normal. We don't realize this until we talk about it, right? Like, we don't know that other people think differently, see things differently in our heads, unless we talk about it. The other thing that really inspired me to make this is a video by Charlie Neeb, where she uses a symphony to act as a metaphor for how she feels her brain is. And it's fascinating. I love the way that she explains things, and she's very like self-aware. And if you're interested in this, definitely go see that video. I will link that in my description. For the purposes of this discussion today, I just want to call these things brain spices. There's no specific category in here of like specifically diagnoses or specifically things that have labels. They can include those, but they can also include just our experiences, how we think, how our attention is. There's a lot of different areas that I think are worth talking about, and they don't really have a great broad category that I could think of. So I just like the name brain spices because they add a little bit of spice to our brain. They add a little bit of flavor to our brain. They're not good or bad. We're not talking here about any type of brain being better or worse. We're just talking about differences because I think it's good to talk about. If you like to identify as neurospicy, or you find that to be a label that is helpful for you, I don't want to take that away from you by calling this brain spices. You can have spices in a dish, and it's not necessarily going to be something you would describe as spicy. It's just got spices in it. So hopefully that makes sense. The thing with this conversation is that we don't always know what to talk about. We don't always know what questions to ask to kind of dive deeper into this. So I just thought what I would do is reflect on some of my brain spices, some of the things that I consider brain spices, just to kind of open the door to some discussion or some reflection. And if you want to give some insight into some of your own experiences, into some of your own spices, that would be awesome. Since watching that My Brain is a Symphony video, I have tried to think of a metaphor to describe my own brain, and I really fell short of one. Like, I can't really think of a good metaphor for my brain, but I did think of a couple of similes to describe some of the experiences with my brain. So I'll start with that and then just go into some other brain spices. I feel like I'm constantly a detective in my own life. And it's like, what was I doing? Where was I going? Where did this bruise come from? Where did this thing come from? Why is this thing here? I am constantly asking myself questions and trying to find answers to all sorts of things because I just don't know. So what am I saying? What am I saying? Oh, what am I saying? What was I saying? And this is a very ADHD thing. I feel like so much of my cognitive resources sometimes in my time are spent backtracing and trying to figure out what I was actually doing. So I would describe my attention kind of like a spotlight, which I think is not abnormal, but where that spotlight goes is sometimes feels like it's out of my control. I don't realize that the spotlight has moved until I'm like, oh, doing the thing, thinking the thing under this new spotlight area. And it's really hard for me to switch right back to what else, the other thing that I was focused on. And I really struggle when something interrupts me and interrupts my attention. So sometimes that's things like weird sensory things. Sometimes that's things like, just as a simple example, if I was playing tennis or ping pong and we have an extra ball, I get really distracted holding that extra ball. I struggle to focus on hitting the ball with the racket and also holding the spare ball and not dropping one of the things. So I can ignore sensory icks sometimes if I'm if they're not above a certain threshold. But as soon as I have that attention shift, again, it's not always it's very rarely intentional, but as soon as I have that attention shift, that's where I like start to get really bombarded by that sensory ick. So things like my fingers, if I'm aware of how my fingers feel, I feel very agitated and uncomfortable about that. Like, especially like sometimes it's like my pinky finger and how it rubs against this finger, like it just gives me the ick. Or awareness of my nose, both like the feeling of the tip of my nose and also seeing my nose from my peripherals. Like as I talk about it, it starts to really bother me. Um, Also, I like holding a pen, I'm really weird with. Like I can hold a pen just regularly without thinking about it. But once I start thinking about how I hold a pen, I start to just like malfunction. My brain just forgets how it does those things, and I am like, I don't know. It all feels weird. It all feels terrible. Typing too, using chopsticks. Those are all things that like with my fingers are kind of funny. And then there's just like sensory icks in terms of like materials, like polyester is really bad for me. Like I hate a lot of like gym athletic wear, like the synthetics are kind of really gross to me. I also get the ick from like fuzzy looking things. So for example, this like wind cover for this microphone, like when I'm watching a video with a wind cover very prominent, like it takes a lot for me to not focus on how gross the wind cover makes me feel. Or fuzzy steering wheels, oh my word. I guess that kind of ties into how like I get really agitated in extremes. So similar to like the sensory things, if I can't ignore it, like if it's in my awareness, it really starts to bother me. And in some instances, rather than me just getting like really kind of upset or grossed out or just uncomfortable, I will actually get kind of ragey. And I would put that more with like things like temperature extremes or sound extremes. So things like the scraping of a plate or a really loud like alarm, like something that's really so loud that it just like does a hard reset on your brain. Those things just make me so angry. In terms of temperature, if I get like really, really cold, or if I get really, really hot or burned, I will start to get really angry. And I'm not really an angry person. I'm not really a ragey person. But when I am in those extremes, I think it's because I just like cannot ignore that. And it's just like this constant thing in my brain. I really struggle with that stuff. I do have aphantasia, so I do not visualize things in my head. I would say that I think of like the features of the thing, but I do not see the thing. So for example, if I was thinking of a snowman, I can think of like a snowman. These are the features of this snowman. It's wearing this hat. It's got eyes made out of buttons and a carrot nose and a mouth with rocks for a smile. I can imagine those things, but I am not getting a complete picture of the things. I'm just thinking of like the features of the thing. And when I'm kind of like trying to think of if something would like look good, it's like I'm going off of vibes. It's like, does it feel like it would look good to me? So my dreams feel like they're visual. From what I can remember of them, but I cannot actually picture anything that I dreamt. So I have the concepts of what I've dreamt a little bit. My dreams make no friggin' sense at all and are always like this thing turned into this thing, turned into this thing, but it feels like it's visual from my experience of it. So I would say like I think in words in my head, but I don't have a voice in my head. Like I don't hear my own voice in my head when I'm thinking, but I do think in words. I don't hear a conversation in my head, but I have the words in my head. And when I'm having a conversation like with somebody else in my head, I have the words in my head, but I'm not like hearing two different people talking, and I'm not obviously visualizing the other person, but I'm thinking of the person. And I do get songs stuck in my head, but usually it's like the words and like the basic sound of the song that I could like vocalize. So I will like get the words stuck in my head or the feeling of the words, and then I will kind of like have to sing it out to like kind of get that itch out of my head. I do find a lot of like social things are quite draining for me, but there's some social situations that do energize me at the same time. I think I just like have a lot of overthinking in terms of myself, and I have a hard time like expressing myself in certain social situations. I would say just in terms of my own like social interaction style, I do best in groups of probably 4 or less, like including myself. 6 I can kind of do. Once the group gets a little bigger, like 6, 8 plus, then I kind of don't really know how to exist in that group. So I find like it's just so hard for me to know like what to pay attention to, who to listen to. I also just like feel like I don't really know how to exist in like say a crowd. So I do go to a lot of concerts, but I feel like when I'm just like standing around and like especially in like the in-between sets times, I just like don't know what to do with myself. Like what do I do with my hands? Like especially if I'm alone, right? Like if I'm with somebody else, it's fine. But as I'm like aware of my surroundings and if I'm like by myself or something, I just like feel like I just don't know how to exist in those settings. So ever since I was a kid, I would describe myself as being consistently inconsistent. And that's kind of with like a lot of like physical like sports things. I often like do not use the same force all the time. I'm really bad at like honing in a specific way of doing things, which can make learning a lot of things kind of challenging, because while like people often learn by doing, I also kind of forget what the doing feels like. And I'm really bad at replicating it exactly. Things like dancing are really hard for me to like map and stick into my head and stay consistent with doing the same way all the time. I would not really identify as having anxiety per se, but I do feel like I'm an anxious person, if that makes sense. Like I've never been like diagnosed with anxiety, but when I had my ADHD assessment, they did mention that it seemed like I also had some anxiety, but it could be related to the ADHD. And I would say it's primarily like with the anxieties for me, the things that I would say I'm like anxious about, it's mostly things that I have like a heightened awareness of and that I just focus on a lot in my brain. So a lot of like germ related things, which I mean, I worked in healthcare, I worked in food service. I'm very aware of germs and ways to like prevent germ spread, and also ways that germs do spread. So I just am very aware of those things. And so it's like, when I see somebody just like cough out in the open or sneeze in public, it just like really sticks with me for a long time. Like I'll be like, oh, am I gonna get sick now? And like it just, I have like a lot of those thoughts that cycle, and then I'm like, okay, I gotta stop thinking about this, because then that might be like something that leads to me getting sick. So I don't want to think about it, but it's just so hard for me not to. COVID probably did not help with that. So I've had to deal with bed bugs twice in my life, and that is 2 times too many for anyone to have to deal with bed bugs. And so I now have like a very heightened awareness of bed bugs and things that are like more high risk. So anything where it's like traveling on public transport or like staying in hotels, things like that, I just always act as if. So it's like throw your stuff in the dryer, high heat, like right away. And so it just adds an extra layer of like complexity to travel, but then it also makes me anxious, like going to other people's houses or having other people visit me, because I know other people don't take those precautions. And I know that it's something that can like just happen. It's just like a weight on the things that I do in my life, if that makes sense. So it's not that big of a deal, but it just adds this layer of complexity that I'm aware of that not everybody else is. Or things like cars. I'm so worried about like myself or somebody else getting injured in a car accident or dying. Like those are things that I'm like so aware of as a concern that it's just, I'll still do it. I'll still get in cars and stuff. But like if I'm in, I prefer to be in only certain people's vehicles. I prefer to be driving compared to certain people. And I still like taking an Uber or a taxi like freaks me the heck out. So there's a lot of things that like, yeah, I would say they just weigh on my consciousness. They weigh on my thoughts. And because I have a brain that really sticks with like a main awareness, say if I'm like really worried about X thing, that's a thing that's going to be cycling my head a lot and it's hard to get it out. I guess that's kind of the way that the things that I would say I'm like anxious about, that's how they weigh on my head. I'm sure there's a lot of people who like the way that anxiety manifests for them is not even like that. I don't even know. Like, I don't know what else to put these as a category in. And I like, they don't prevent me from living my life, but they do just add a little bit of a weight, if that makes sense. I feel like I have a disconnect sometimes between like my logic brain and my like emotion feeling, and I can recognize that they are not matching. Like if I'm being irrational, so let's say like I am upset about something and I am saying things that don't really make sense. Like I am maybe blowing things out of proportion, or I am being a little bit like overreactionary in terms of like how I'm talking about things or whatever. In the midst of me doing that, I recognize how irrational I'm being, but I cannot really change like the way that my body feels and the way that my brain feels, but I can recognize how ridiculous it is. And like, I just don't really get into a lot of like fights because in the midst of them, I will start like laughing at myself because it's like, this is so stupid. Why am I like feeling this strongly about this? Or like, why am I crying right now? Why do I feel like this? And so I will kind of recognize that it doesn't make sense, but I also have to like deal with the fact that like I still have to like let those emotions out somehow. I still have to find a way to like release that energy in a healthy way, but also like, yeah, okay, this is not a rational me speaking. So I think this stuff is really important to talk about, in part because a label can only give us so much understanding. Our experience of those labels can be so different. And I tried to, for this video, kind of avoid talking specifically about labels because of that. I wanted to try and get a little bit more into what my internal feelings of these things are, rather than relying on just saying like, this is what I have. Other people may have different ways of describing things. And I think it's important to make sure that we are talking about that stuff, because if we only go on labels, we're probably going to associate things with our experience of the label. So if we have somebody that we know who maybe has a certain diagnosis, and that is our only understanding of that diagnosis, we may be accidentally or unintentionally applying our understanding of that label to somebody else who has the same diagnosis but presents very differently. So I just think that's really good to keep in mind, is that I really think it's important for us to remember that we do not need to relate to something to appreciate that it's reality for somebody else. We do not need to see something to appreciate that it is reality for somebody else. So for example, even outside of the kind of brain spices that I've been talking about today, things like invisible illnesses or chronic pain are things we can't necessarily see, but they exist for people, and people are going through that. I would even say that kind of that could be a brain spice, if you want to call it a brain spice. And being trans is another thing that like, I don't understand the feeling of being trans, but I can appreciate that that is a reality for somebody else that I have absolutely no authority to deny for somebody, and that we should be listening to people's stories, listening to people's experiences, and just remembering that their experiences may not be our experiences, and that is okay. It doesn't make them invalid. It doesn't make them not true. So I just think it's good to expose ourselves to these different ideas, these different ways of thinking, because again, we don't realize that there's so many differences unless we talk about it. One more thing that I think it's also helpful for is just for remembering that the same experience can come with a different cognitive and energy cost for different people. The same activity could be done by several different people and be done to a certain standard, like where it looks externally the same, but internally it can have very different cognitive load for people, different energy loads for people. And I think that's just important to remember just for ourselves, and also just for how we think of other people. We cannot assume that the same tasks are the same experience for everyone. Even something simple like having a conversation or having a shower can be so internally different for people, just depending on what's going on in their heads, as well as physically, obviously, but there's a lot of things that can go on in our heads that make those experiences very, very different. Yeah, we don't know all these things are going on in other people's heads unless we talk about it. And I just think being aware of that, having conversations about it can be helpful to just understand the people that we're around more. I don't think you need to talk about this with everybody, but I do think in terms of relationships and friendships, it can be really helpful just to understand the people we care about. For me, I've had experiences where I will be doing something with a friend and I would have no clue. The internal experience that they were having was so different from mine unless we talked about it. I'm so grateful whenever somebody I care about shares insight into how their brain works. Thanks so much for joining me. Hopefully this video helped you to reflect a little bit on your own brain spices. And if you would like to leave a comment to share maybe some of yours or things that you were wow, that's a thing, or things that you relate to, that would be so cool. Thanks. Take care. Bye.